The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood, cold air conditioning, and the nervous sweat of people who had convinced themselves that this time, justice would be on their side. A bailiff with a voice like gravel stood near the entrance. His badge gleamed under the overhead lights as he announced the case. Calling the matter of Linda Carver versus Nathaniel Walton. Plaintiff is suing for unpaid rent, late fees, damages to property, and missing household items. The courtroom door opened with a long mechanical sigh. In walked Linda Carver, a woman in her early 50s with a surprisingly confident stride, the kind of stride that belonged to people who believed the law was on their side, and that they could prove it. Her blonde hair was tied back tightly, her blouse crisply ironed, and her expression already had that, "I've waited long enough for justice" determination carved onto it. Right behind her shuffled Nathaniel Walton, who looked to be around 30. He wore a loose shirt, jeans, and the unmistakable expression of someone who had rehearsed excuses all morning. He tried to appear calm but gave himself away each time he tugged nervously on the sleeves of his shirt. Today, the courtroom belonged to Judge Helena Marks, a sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed woman with decades of watching people lie to her face, and not a shred of patience left for excuses. She sat elevated on the bench, tapping her pen lightly in a rhythmic, almost warning pattern. The cameras around the courtroom lights blinked on. The audience leaned forward. The bailiff announced, "All rise." Judge Marks entered with the calm confidence of someone who knew she ran this room. "You may be seated," she said, barely glancing at the parties as she settled into her chair. She scanned the paperwork before her and looked up. "Ms. Carver, Mr. Walton," she said. "This is a simple case. Landlord suing former tenant for unpaid rent and damages. But let's see if it stays simple, which, experience tells me, it usually does not." Linda nodded crisply. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "Ms. Carver," the judge continued, "I'll begin with you. You claim the defendant lived in your rental property, paid rent inconsistently, caused damage, and left with some items that you want returned or compensated. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And Mr. Walton," Judge Marks said, turning to him, "you claim you owe nothing. You say there were violations of the lease, that rent was withheld lawfully, and that the plaintiff allowed you to grow plants on the property which later became a problem. Is that accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said, though he did not sound confident. "Good," said the judge. "Now let's get into the details." She looked at Linda. "Ms. Carver, begin." Linda inhaled deeply. "Your Honor, I rented my property originally to Mr. Walton's former girlfriend, Casey. She was the only one on the lease. But after she moved out, Nathaniel stayed in the home. He and I later signed a new lease agreement, which I have with me." The judge held out her hand. "Give it to the bailiff." Bailiff Thompson stepped forward, retrieved the printed lease documents, and handed them up to Judge Marks, who examined them quickly. "This appears to be a digitally signed lease, dated July 2nd, the judge noted. "Rent listed, $225 every 2 weeks. Linda nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Before that, the girlfriend's rent was weekly. But when he signed on, we changed it to bi-weekly payments." Judge Marks looked at Nathaniel. "You signed this?" "Yes, Your Honor. But I didn't fully read it." Judge Marks held up a finger. "Stop. If you are old enough to sign your name, you are old enough to read what you sign. Excuses about not reading documents are immediately rejected in this courtroom." "Understood." "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered. "Good." She returned her attention to Linda. "You claim he stopped paying rent beginning around August?" "Yes. He paid in July and part of August. But then he stopped because he said he had issues with the house." Judge Marks' eyebrows lifted. "What kind of issues?" "Well, I was selling the house at the time, and he said I violated the lease by letting realtors come for showings." "Did you?" the judge asked. "I did, but only with proper notice. And we added a clause in the lease amendment stating he agreed to keep the home presentable for potential buyers." "That clause is here," the judge said, tapping the document. "It is clearly written." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, she sent people into my house without telling me." Judge Marks leaned forward. Mr. Walton, you're about to test my patience. This document says you agreed to allow showings because you knew the house was for sale. Did you know the house was for sale when you signed this? Yes, Your Honor. And you agreed in writing to keep it in condition for buyers? Yes, Your Honor. Then you do not suddenly get to use showings as an excuse not to pay rent. If you didn't like it, you should not have signed the lease. Nathaniel swallowed hard and nodded. Now, Judge Marks said, how many rent periods did you miss? I missed 3, he replied hesitantly. You said earlier to the mediator it was 6, Linda interrupted. Judge Marks cut her off with a raised hand. Quiet, I'll get to that. She turned to Nathaniel. How many payments did you miss? Not estimates. Not guesses. Give me the facts. Nathaniel shifted again. I missed 6 payments, Your Honor. Judge Marks scribbled something on her pad. So at $225 every 2 weeks, 6 missed payments equals $675. Correct. Nathaniel sighed. Yes, Your Honor. That alone is owed, Judge Marks said. Now let's move on. She flipped another page. It says here that part of the lease amendment required you to finish some trim work and painting inside the house. Did you do that? No, Your Honor, Nathaniel admitted. Judge Marks turned to Linda. And was that work ever done by someone else later? Yes, Your Honor, and I paid for it. How much? I have receipts. $4.30. The judge nodded. We'll come back to that. She flipped again. Now let's discuss the items listed in the lease that you, she pointed at Linda, say were missing after he moved out. Stove, refrigerator, dishwasher, microwave, washer, dryer, toaster oven, cappuccino maker. Nathaniel lifted both his hands. I left everything, Your Honor. Linda frowned. Your Honor, everything was eventually returned. But when he left, everything was unplugged, dragged into the hallway, and the cappuccino machine was missing a part. Judge Marks looked at Nathaniel. Did you dismantle appliances before you left? I unplugged them because I thought that was required, he said defensively. I didn't damage anything. Judge Marks stared for a long second. Why would unplugging and dragging appliances into the hallway be required in any universe you've ever lived in? Nathaniel had no answer. Thought so, the judge said. Then she reached the page labeled photographs of damage. Ms. Carver, she asked, you have photos? Yes, Your Honor. Bailiff Thompson carried several printed photographs to the bench. The judge examined them. Broken interior door, scratch marks along the hallway, damaged window screens, and what is this? She paused. This looks like a large potted plant area in the backyard. Yes, Your Honor, Linda said. He was growing marijuana on the property. Nathaniel blurted. She told me I could. The judge's pen tapped sharply. Excuse me, Nathaniel continued. It was outside. She said it was okay to grow plants there. Judge Marks cut him off. Plants, yes. Drugs, no. Unless your landlord walked up to you and said, I want you to grow marijuana on the property. Which makes absolutely no sense. You do not get to blame her for that. Linda folded her arms proudly. Judge Marks looked between both parties. And we will address that in the damage category. She closed the folder. For now, let's summarize. 6 missed rent payments. Damage to the home. Additional cleaning and repairs. And possible violations of local property regulations. She took a breath. This case is nowhere near finished. The tension in the room thickened as Judge Helena Marks set the photos aside and folded her hands in front of her. Her gaze, sharp, unwavering, moved between Linda and Nathaniel as though she were reading every lie, every truth, and every half-truth simmering beneath the surface. All right, she said slowly. Let's press deeper. She turned her chair slightly to face Nathaniel. Mr. Walton, we've established that you missed rent payments. You've admitted that. Good. But now we must examine your claim that you withheld rent because the landlord, Ms. Carver, violated the lease. Nathaniel inhaled and straightened his shoulders as though finally ready to defend himself. Yes, Your Honor. She Judge Marks raised her hand. Before you speak, let me remind you that any claim you make must be supported by evidence. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Proceed. Nathaniel cleared his throat. Your Honor, the lease stated that she had to give at least 24 hours notice before showing the house to potential buyers. But she sent people into the house without telling me. I would come home from work and find footprints, moved furniture, sometimes even the lights left on. I felt unsafe. Linda's eyes widened dramatically, almost theatrically. That is absolutely untrue, she snapped. The judge shot her a glare. You will speak only when I address you, Miss Carver. Linda shut her mouth and flicked her eyes to the ceiling. Judge Marks turned back to Nathaniel. Do you have proof of unauthorized entry? Nathaniel hesitated. Well, no, Your Honor. But, stop. Proof means text messages, emails, notices, or witnesses. Do you have any of that? No, Your Honor. Then your argument is weak at best and non-existent at worst. Nathaniel exhaled in frustration. Your Honor, she even changed the lock once while I was living there. Linda gasped loudly. That's a lie, she protested. Judge Marks did not even look at her. She simply pointed a finger in Linda's direction. A silent order to be quiet. She looked back at Nathaniel. Do you have proof of the locks being changed? No, Your Honor. Then do not bring it up again. A small chuckle rippled through the courtroom audience. Nathaniel clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Judge Marks leaned back in her chair. Now, Miss Carver, she finally said, turning her attention to the plaintiff. Respond to his allegations. Did you ever allow showings without notice? Linda shook her head firmly. No, Your Honor. Every single showing was scheduled by the real estate agent, and I always notified Nathaniel through text. I printed the conversation. She held up a stack of screenshots. Give them to the bailiff, the judge ordered. Bailiff Thompson retrieved the documents and handed them to Judge Marks. The judge skimmed the first page, then the second, then the third. Text on July 14th. Nate, I have a showing tomorrow at 3 p.m. His reply, okay. Text on July 26th. There will be a showing at 11 a.m. Please keep the house presentable. His reply, sure. Text on August 2nd. Another showing tomorrow morning. His reply, all right. She looked up. So far, every instance shows proper notice and acknowledgement from you. Nathaniel's cheeks burned red. I didn't see some of those messages until later. Judge Marks cut him off sharply. That is irrelevant. If the message was sent to your number and you responded, you cannot claim ignorance. The law does not bend to your convenience. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. The judge flipped another page. Here, she continued, is a message from you on August 20th. I need more notice next time, please. Ms. Carver responded. Understood. I will notify you at least 24 hours before any showing. And if I'm reading correctly, every showing afterward includes a timestamp at least 24 hours prior. She closed the packet. So your claim of unauthorized entry is unsubstantiated. Nathaniel tried again. Your Honor, it wasn't just the showings. There were repairs she promised to make but never did. Judge Marks raised an eyebrow. Such as, the air conditioning wasn't working well during August, and she never fixed it. Linda laughed under her breath. Judge Marks snapped her attention toward her. Ms. Carver, quiet. Yes, Your Honor, Linda muttered. The judge looked back to Nathaniel. Did you notify her in writing about the air conditioning issue? Yes, I texted her. Do you have those messages? Yes. He pulled out his phone. I screenshotted them. Give them to the bailiff. Bailiff Thompson delivered the screenshots to the judge. Judge Marks read silently. Linda, AC not cooling very well. Linda, can someone check the AC? Linda, it's hot in here. She turned the page. Then Ms. Carver replies. Repairman scheduled for Thursday. Another message. Repairman came. Said system is old. Still works but not great. Your response? Okay. Nathaniel blinked sheepishly. So the AC was checked? The judge asked. Yes. And you acknowledged that? Yes. And you continued living there? Yes. Then why are you bringing this up? Nathaniel fumbled for words. Because it still wasn't great. Judge Mark stared at him. And neither were your rent payments. A wave of laughter rolled through the audience. The judge smacked her gavel lightly. Order. She turned back to Linda. Ms. Carver, let's move on to the damage portion of the lawsuit. Tell me exactly what damage you found when Mr. Walton moved out. Linda straightened her shoulders. Yes, Your Honor. When he left, he didn't clean anything. The kitchen was stained. The walls had scratches. One interior door had a fist-sized hole in it, and the backyard had been torn up because he was growing plants. Illegal ones. Nathaniel shook his head vigorously. I wasn't growing them inside the house. They were outside. And she said. Judge Marks slammed her hand down on the bench. Mr. Walton, do not interrupt again unless you want to be escorted out. Yes, Your Honor, he whispered. The judge turned to Linda. Continue. Your Honor, he built makeshift wooden planters against the fence. The wood rotted and left deep stains. There was soil everywhere, plastic containers, and remnants of the plants. The judge exhaled slowly. Did you take photos? Yes. Give them to the bailiff. More photos were handed over. The judge flipped through them one by one. One showed wooden boxes collapsing into dark soil. Another displayed deep muddy grooves across the yard. Evidence of heavy pots dragged across grass. Another captured a plastic bucket filled with soil and roots. Then she reached a photo that made her blink twice. It showed tall, leafy plants, too familiar in shape for her liking. She lifted the picture slightly. These are marijuana plants. Yes, Your Honor, Linda said firmly. He was growing them. Nathaniel burst out. They weren't even fully grown. The courtroom erupted in laughter again. Judge Marks glared at him. That is not a defense. Nathaniel muttered under his breath. Judge Marks tapped the photo with her pen. Mr. Walton, did you grow marijuana on this property? Yes, Your Honor. But she... No. Stop. Did you or did you not grow marijuana? Yes, Your Honor. Did you ask your landlord for written permission? No. Then it was prohibited. Nathaniel opened his mouth again. I told her verbally, and she said, verbal agreements do not override written leases, the judge snapped, especially when the written lease explicitly prohibits illegal activity on the property. She tossed the photos aside. Therefore, the damage to the yard is on you. She turned back to Linda. How much did restoration cost? I have the bills. $610. Accepted. Nathaniel's shoulders slumped. Judge Marks leaned back. So far, the total is... She checked her notes. $675 for unpaid rent. $430 for interior repairs. $610 for yard restoration. She clicked her pen. That totals $1,715 before any additional claims. Nathaniel's eyes widened. Your Honor, I don't have that kind of money. That is not the court's problem, she said dryly. The audience chuckled again. Judge Marks glanced at another page in the folder. And finally, we have the matter of items allegedly missing or damaged when you moved out. Nathaniel sighed loudly. I returned everything. Ms. Carver? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. But the cappuccino machine's frothing attachment was missing and had to be replaced. How much? $40. The judge nodded. Add it. Nathaniel threw up his hands. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Judge Marks fixed him with a stare so cold it could freeze lava. Mr. Walton, what's ridiculous is believing you can live in someone's home, violate the lease, cause damage, grow illegal plants, and then claim you owe nothing. Nathaniel sank back into silence. The judge took a deep breath, folded her hands again, and looked directly at both parties. We are now very close to closing this case. She leaned forward. But before I issue a final ruling, I have one more question. She turned her gaze to Nathaniel. Why? She asked slowly. Did you stay in the property after the original tenant? Your girlfriend moved out. You were not on the lease at that time. Nathaniel hesitated. Then he spoke the truth. Because I had nowhere else to go. The judge paused. For the first time in the trial, her expression softened. Not much, but enough to be noticeable. But her voice remained firm. Having nowhere else to go, she said, does not entitle you to live for free, damage property, or violate the terms of a lease. Nathaniel nodded, defeated. Judge Marks picked up her pen again. This court will now prepare to deliver judgment. The courtroom had grown so still that every breath, every shifting shoe, every heartbeat felt amplified. Even the cameras seemed to quiet themselves, sensing that the moment of judgment was near. Judge Helena Marks locked her fingers together on the bench and stared at both parties with a gaze that had reduced dozens of defendants before them to silence. This case, she began, is straightforward in the law but messy in human behavior. The law doesn't bend for your personal conflicts, misunderstandings, or poor decision-making. It only follows the facts. She lifted the lease agreement again. And the facts here are exceptionally clear. Nathaniel dragged a hand across his face, bracing himself. Linda sat upright, hands folded neatly in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin, confident line. Judge Marks continued, Mr. Walton, you stayed in a property after the original tenant moved out. You then signed a new lease digitally, yes, but signatures are signatures. That makes it binding. You agreed to biweekly rent payments. You agreed to keep the house presentable for showings. You agreed to complete minor interior trim work and painting. You agreed to maintain the property in good condition. She paused. And you did none of those things. Nathaniel looked down at the floor, shoulders heavy. But more importantly, she went on, you withheld rent for reasons that the law does not accept. Let me explain something to you, and to anyone else watching this show, because this mistake is common. She pointed her pen at the defendant. If a tenant believes the landlord is violating the lease, the tenant must document those violations and follow proper legal procedure. The tenant cannot simply decide, well, I don't like what's happening, so I'm not paying. She leaned in. That is not how adult life works. Linda gave a tiny satisfied nod. The judge looked at her sharply.
And don't look so victorious, Ms. Carver. We're not finished. Linda blinked, nervous now. Judge Marks shifted her attention to the papers before her. Now we move to damages. She lifted the photos of the interior door. Here we have a hole in a bedroom door. Mr. Walton, you didn't deny this damage. Who caused the hole? Nathaniel hesitated. My dog ran into the door. Judge Marks raised a skeptical brow. Your dog punched a hole into the door at exactly fist height. The courtroom audience erupted in laughter. Bailiff Thompson smirked. Nathaniel flushed. Okay. I tripped and fell into it. Judge Marks nodded deliberately. At least that version of the story contains physics. More laughter. She sighed. Regardless of how it happened, the repair was necessary. So that cost is yours. She set the photo aside and picked up another. Wall scratches, chipped paint. These scratches were not normal wear and tear. They are consistent with moving furniture without proper care. Nathaniel rubbed his forehead. Your Honor, I didn't have help when moving. Some things were heavy. Judge Marks tapped her pen. That may be true, but heavy furniture does not give you a legal pass to damage property. She pushed those photos aside and picked up the next set, photos of the yard. These, she said, holding up the image of the marijuana plants, are the biggest problem. Nathaniel swallowed. Your Honor, they were outside. I wasn't hiding anything. That is not a defense, she repeated coldly. Growing illegal plants on a landlord's property is a serious violation of the lease and could expose the landlord to liability. She turned to Linda. Ms. Carver, did neighbors complain? Linda nodded. Yes, Your Honor. One neighbor threatened to call the city because he recognized the plants. Judge Marks stared at Nathaniel. So your actions didn't just damage the yard, they created legal risk. That justifies the restoration cost. She sat back. Now, about the appliances. Nathaniel lifted his chin slightly. I didn't steal anything. The judge nodded. That seems to be true. But you did return everything in poor condition. Dragging appliances into the hallway was completely unnecessary and likely contributed to minor damage to walls. Nathaniel exhaled helplessly. I was trying to clean behind them. The judge blinked. Let me ask, you cleaned behind the appliances, but not a single countertop? The camera zoomed on Nathaniel's bewildered face. More laughter. And finally, Judge Marks concluded, the cappuccino machine piece. Nathaniel threw his hands up. I didn't even know that thing had pieces. Judge Marks pointed at him sharply. Your lack of mechanical knowledge does not reduce liability. It was part of the property. It was missing. She replaced it. You pay. Nathaniel groaned. The judge shuffled her papers into a neat stack. That brings your total to $1,715 plus $40 equals $1,755. But she didn't stop. I also reviewed your claim that the landlord violated the lease by entering the property without notice. But your own text messages contradict that claim. She clicked her pen. So you owe. Then she turned slowly to Linda. As for you, there's one issue I want clarity on. Linda straightened, surprised. Your Honor. You said you notified him of every showing? Yes. And the texts confirm that. Good. But you also promised him that notice would always be at least 24 hours in advance. Yes. The judge flipped to a page near the end. But here, on August 11th, the text shows you notified him at 6 p.m. about an 11 a.m. showing the next morning. Linda froze. Nathaniel's eyes widened with hope. Judge Marks looked at him sharply. Do not get excited. This isn't the victory you think. The audience snickered. Judge Marks continued to Linda. This means you gave him roughly 17 hours of notice, not 24. Linda swallowed. The buyer was flying in from out of state and the real estate agent pressured me. I didn't think. That, said the judge, is precisely the problem. She leaned forward. The lease is binding on you, too. If you expect the tenant to follow it, you must follow it. You promised 24 hours. You did not honor that one time. Nathaniel sat up straighter, hope rising again. But Judge Marks crushed that hope instantly. That said, one violation does not negate months of unpaid rent or damage. It does not erase responsibility. It does not provide legal justification for withholding rent. She paused, thinking. However, it does merit a small penalty. Linda looked shocked. Penalty? Your Honor, Be quiet. A judge is speaking. Linda shut her mouth fast. Judge Marks adjusted her glasses. For failing to provide full notice for one showing, I am deducting $75, an appropriate penalty for breaching your own lease obligation. Nathaniel blinked. So, the total becomes. The judge wrote the figure on the pad. $1,680. Nathaniel whispered something like, "Oh man." Judge Marks raised her voice again. Now let me address one more thing, your claim about withholding rent because the money was in escrow. Do you have documentation of an escrow account? Nathaniel froze. I kept it aside, in cash. Judge Marks stared at him. So you had the money in a shoebox, essentially. Yes. That's not escrow, she said bluntly. That's called stalling. The audience roared with laughter. Judge Marks banged her gavel lightly. Order. Then she closed the folder with finality. Mr. Walton, I'm giving you some advice you didn't ask for but desperately need. Life gets difficult. But when you sign legal documents, you must read them. When you owe money, you must pay it. When something breaks, you must fix it or notify someone. She leaned forward again. And you can't grow illegal plants on someone else's property. Ever. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. She turned to Linda. And Ms. Carver, follow your own lease requirements in the future. Tenants may be messy, unreliable, and sometimes infuriating, but that doesn't mean you get to disregard your obligations. Linda nodded sincerely. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Marks lifted her gavel. My decision is as follows. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $1,680. Payable within 60 days. Case dismissed.
Bang!
The gavel struck. Linda let out a breath she had been holding for months. Nathaniel slumped backward, part defeated, part relieved the number wasn't higher. Bailiff Thompson announced, case dismissed. Parties are excused. As they walked out of the courtroom, the camera followed them, because Judge Marks' show wasn't just about law. It was about life lessons delivered with a sharp edge of justice. Linda spoke first during the post-verdict interview.
I'm relieved.
I just wanted fairness. He lived there, he damaged things, he didn't pay rent. I'm glad the judge saw through everything. Nathaniel was more humble. I messed up, a lot. I should have paid. I should have read the lease. I should have never grown those plants there. I'm gonna do better. The camera panned out. Narrator, in Judge Marks' courtroom, excuses wilt quickly, and accountability always takes root. The screen faded to black. End of story.